Welcome everybody, session 6 of the 2022 Red Pill Expo here in Salt Lake City, Utah. And we've got some afternoon sessions before and after lunch, and I'm just ready to go on this one. You know that all rights are derived from property? It's true, but we don't even know the difference between a right and a privilege anymore. And if you want to learn how much we don't own our own property, try to ranch in America. Find out how the government will intervene with you and say, hey, you don't have the right to do what you're doing with what you thought was your property, or your children, or your own body, which they want to mandate injections for, or drugs for, or prohibit you from using other things that will be good for you. It's a fascinating journey we're on to rediscover the origin of our rights. We're going to start with someone who knows very well what is that like to interface in that regard. The topic, without the right to private property, you are a slave. Let's welcome to the Red Pill Expo stage, Nathan Descheemaeker. Come on up, Nathan. Welcome. Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you.
See you.
Hello, everybody. Alrighty, like you said, Nathan Descheemaeker, live in Montana, run a cattle ranch, East Central Montana. Stepfather passed away about 8 years ago, and I've been on the place since then. So it's been a journey. Grew up on a cattle ranch, East Central Montana, or more Central Montana. The issue today is broad with land use and many other issues. As you see up here, that's you travel through Central or Eastern Montana, you're going to see these signs all across the state. Save the cowboy, stop the American Prairie Reserve. American Prairie Reserve is a special interest, tax-exempt foundation, NGO, that is seeking to buy up all the inholdings, private inholdings around a bunch of Bureau of Land Management federal lands around the CMR Game Refuge, already existing 1.1 million acre reserve. They want to create a 3.5 million acre bison reserve and displace all of the agricultural production through 5 counties, or a good portion of 5 counties and state grazing districts in the region. I am not going to be going too much in this conversation into that background per se, but I wanted to put the backdrop up there for you guys, and that's a battle we are fighting in Montana. This is an issue that got me involved with local governments to help provide technical assistance to our county commissioners to engage with our federal counterparts. Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, etc. Those agencies have a lot of administrative authority that touches millions of acres of our lands through the western United States, that affects the natural resource industries, that affects every single one of you. It doesn't matter if you live in the middle of nowhere, or if you're in the city or in a town or wherever you live. Everything comes from the ground. From the clothes on your back, the fuel you put in your vehicle, the energy that allows you to go in and flip a switch on your wall and turn a little knob and control your heat and cooling. It all comes from the ground. So I've made our natural resource industry a priority in my life to engage in relationship to all that federal real estate, because there is a lot of international, national, special interest organizations that want to leverage that federal land to control and tie up our ability to access those resources. So very, very important issue that we have to deal with. We've had a lot of success working with county governments and engaging in these processes with our federal agencies and state agencies even. But today I'm going to be talking about heritage. The Marxists know that to destroy our liberties, they have to sever us from our heritage and from our roots and where we come from. So I'm going to be mainly discussing that for the most part. I have right here a book. This is the first book of William Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England. 4 volumes of this were published just before the Declaration of Independence in the United States of America. This was the second most cited document by the framers of the founding documents of our country. The Bible was the first. Spirit of the Laws by Montesquieu was the third most cited document by our framers. So I'm just going to share with you guys some words from Mr. Blackstone that are rooted in English common law, because nobody, even our lawyers today, are reading William Blackstone's work. This used to be fundamental for our law schools in this country, for our attorneys to study and understand how law functions and the principles of law that are supposed to govern our system and protect you, the individual. William Blackstone, and I'm skipping ahead in this and just going to read a couple things. Three things he goes over, and the title of this is Commentaries on the Laws of England, Book 1, The Rights of Persons. And he calls them the absolute rights of persons. And he breaks it down into life, liberty, and property. He says the absolute rights of man considered as a free agent, endowed with discernment to know good from evil, and with power of choosing those measures which appear to him to be most desirable, are usually summed up in one general appellation and denominated the natural liberty of mankind. This natural liberty consists properly in a power of acting as one thinks fit, without any restraint or control, unless by the laws of nature, being a right inherent in us by birth, and one of the gifts of God to man at his creation, when he endued him with the faculty of free will. Blackstone goes on and discusses those three categories: life, liberty, and property. So one thing under the heading of life, the first thing he deals with is, and this is something for the abortion issue, Supreme Court just ruled on the Roe versus Wade and some other things, but in all the abortion debates you hear out there, you're not hearing the references from William Blackstone and some of the jurists that ruled on issues concerning abortion through history. Blackstone says the right of personal security consists in a person's legal and uninterrupted enjoyment of his life, his limbs, his body, his health, and his reputation. Life is the immediate gift of God, a right inherent by nature in every individual, and it begins in contemplation of law as soon as an infant is able to stir in the mother's womb. For if a woman is quick with child, and by a potion or otherwise kills it in her womb, or if anyone beat her, whereby the child dies in her body, and she is delivered of a dead child, this, though not murder, was by the ancient law homicide or manslaughter. And he puts a footnote in there and references Henry D. Bracton, who was a jurist in the 1200s, a case reference. But at present, it is not looked upon in quite so atrocious a light, though it remains a very heinous misdemeanor. He goes on and says, an infant in the mother's womb is supposed in law to be born for many purposes. It is capable of having a legacy or a surrender of a copyhold estate made to it. It may have a guardian assigned to it, and it is enabled to have an estate limited to its use and to take afterwards by such limitation as if it were actually born. And in this point, the civil law agrees with ours. He goes on and says, both the life and limbs of a man are of such high value in the estimation of the laws of England that it pardons even homicide if committed in self-defense, or in order to preserve them. For whatever is done by a man to save either life or member is looked upon as done upon the highest necessity and compulsion. William Blackstone, just very, very profound individual, if you read through his works, and very dense, but he really touches so many issues There's nothing new under the sun that we're dealing with. There's just a couple more things I want to read out of this really quick, and then I'm going to move to some other things. So we all know what happened the last couple of years with COVID and the tyranny of trying to lock people down and keep them isolated. Blackstone says the confinement of a person in any way is an imprisonment, so that the keeping a man against his will in a private house, putting him in stocks, arresting or forcibly detaining him in the street is an imprisonment. And the law so much discourages unlawful confinement that if a man is under duress of imprisonment, which we before explained to mean a compulsion by an illegal restraint of liberty, until he seals a bond or a like, he may allege his duress and avoid the extorted bond. So much of, as we all know, much of what's been taking place in our system of government to compel people to be locked up in their homes, separated from their families, is unlawful. There's no basis in our common law history that gives government power to dictate the personal rights of the individual, his life, his liberty, and his property. So great, moreover, is the regard of the law of private property that it will not authorize the least violation of it. No, not even for the general good of the whole community. We heard G. Edward Griffin yesterday discuss that a little bit about where those limitations are. Can government dictate to the individual how he is to govern his own personal affairs? Blackstone says that private property is inviolable. Montana Constitution, by the way, says that the Montana people are guaranteed a system of self-government and that the dignity of the individual is inviolable. You don't have to read very far into the Constitution to see that language. The Constitution of the states, as well as the federal Constitution, are the ordinances, the compacts, the covenants. Federal comes from the Latin term foedus, which means covenant. It is a covenant government. Thomas Hobbes, in his work, said that justice is the keeping of covenants. Injustice is the breaking of covenants. You want to know what the problem in our system is today? We're breaking covenant at every level of society, from our homes, because all our life is a series of covenant relationships. Your marriage, your business relationships in the broader society that you work with people around you and your community, and your civic obligation. If you're like me, I took an oath of office to that covenant, to that compact, to uphold it, and to support it and protect it against enemies, foreign and domestic. And that document was designed by men of wisdom and weight specifically to protect the residual sovereign rights of individual people, the individual person, what William Blackstone called the absolute rights of persons. There's a lot more in here I could probably read from, but those are some key notes I wanted to just read straight from William Blackstone. Nobody's, like I said, reading Blackstone anymore, and very sad because his wisdom touches much of the issues we're facing in the day today. I'm going to go back a little bit farther in history now to a man named John Huss. John Huss was an early 14th century, early 15th century, sorry about that. John Huss of the early 14th century and early 15th century, latter 14th, early 15th century, was a Czech theologian, preceded Luther, Calvin, Zwingli. Huss influenced Martin Luther tremendously. Huss could be attributed with the beginning of the concept of the freedom of religion, or the rights of conscience, and the first Protestant. Huss was burned at the stake by the Emperor of Rome in 1415 for heresy against the doctrines of the Catholic Church. In the trial, Huss was ordered to recant and stated, quote, "I would not for a chapel of gold retreat from the truth." Huss inspired the Bohemian people with the courage to preach truth and oppose the enemies of the truth. The followers of Huss came to be known as Hussites. Luther stated concerning believers, quote, "All of us are Hussites and did not know it." The most notable of the Hussites was their leader in war, John Ziska, a pagan scoundrel converted to Christ, possibly by the preaching of Mr. Huss himself. Ziska and the Hussites defeated 5 consecutive papal crusades between 1420 and 1431, known as the Hussite Wars. Ziska took action to defend Bohemia, and he sent out a letter to his fellow Bohemians, and this is what it said: "Imitate your ancestors, the ancient Bohemians, who were always able to defend the cause of God and their own. We are collecting troops from all parts in order to fight against the enemies of truth and the destroyers of our nation. And I beseech you to inform your preacher that he should exhort in his sermons the people to make war on the Antichrist, and that everyone, old and young, should prepare himself for it, and that you should provide yourselves with good arms. The hand of God has not been shortened. Have courage and be ready. May God strengthen you." Signed, John Ziska, the Chalice, 15th century. You want to watch a really good film and a documentary film that recently came out that goes over some of that history, Christian J. Pinto's True Christian History of America, one of the best films in relationship to this history and heritage that's out there. Highly recommend it. Somebody earlier quoted Frederick Bastiat. Frederick Bastiat said, "And now that the legislators and do-gooders have so futilely inflicted so many systems upon society, may they finally end where they should have begun. May they reject all systems and try liberty. For liberty is an acknowledgement of faith in God and His works." I just wanted to go through a couple of those things from a historical perspective because, as I said, Marxism is all about severing us from our heritage, from where we came from as a people. These men stood alone in many cases against the forces of their day. I would have a duty to stand if I was by myself. And God has really blessed me with a lot of individuals and patriots and freedom-loving people that support me in the work that I do. So I'm doubly duty-bound. One as a citizen of the United States of America by a first birth and a Christian by a second birth to carry forward our heritage. It's a multi-generational battle. And we need more young people that understand our heritage. That's why the communists know if they can get rid of our heritage, they weaken us and they destroy our people. They destroy our nation. And it's happening. One thing I've been doing is really studying our Supreme Court justices. Gorsuch, Thomas Clarence, Antonin Scalia. Not just their court decisions, but reading their books, reading their publications. Because the issues we're facing today, I'm going to come clear forward to our present day. One priority of mine has been the climate policy agenda and the climate change issues. Climate change is nothing more than the mechanism to get the free economies of the West to sell their birthright for a pot of stew. That's what it is about. And it's also the age-old goal for a communist, centrally planned economy. What better way to centrally plan an economy than to control, track, monitor carbon, your carbon? Decarbonization, they call it. So that's one issue I've really made a priority in my life in the last, climate change goes back with me studying that, understanding the dynamics of it. When Biden, let me go back. When Trump came into office 2017, one of the first things he did was pull out of the Paris Accord, right? When that happened, some state governors, California, Washington, and New York, formed a coalition of state governors to uphold those international compacts. People tell me, well, we'll get Biden out of there and we'll deal with these climate issues. What are you going to do about the 24 state governors that are rogue, that are going over to Glasgow, Scotland, and saying they're going to use 60% of their gross domestic product to change the entire North American economy? Coming up to World War II in Nazi Germany, the German system was able to control virtually every aspect of the economy by only controlling centrally about 54% of the federal and local cash flows. Just by breaking that 50% threshold, they indirectly were able to control virtually the entire economy. And we have states that control 60% of the gross domestic product of this nation that are selling out other states in this country in violation of Article 1, Section 10 of the U.S. Constitution, which strictly prohibits states from entering into those international compacts and agreements. The 10th Amendment, with county governments, we help local government flex their 9th and 10th Amendment police powers. Anything not enumerated or prohibited in the Constitution is left respectively to the people and to the states. It is the doctrine of the reservation of powers doctrine. Notice it says enumerated or prohibited therein. Well, guess what's prohibited in Article 1, Section 10 of the U.S. Constitution? Entering into foreign compacts, agreements, etc. We have 24 state governors now that are part of this coalition of state governors to uphold these international compacts. A couple of them might be over in Egypt right now, violating their covenant, violating their oath of office. Like I said, justice is the keeping of covenants. Injustice is the breaking of covenants. The significant point made by wiser men is that once the planners have set the plan, then the supreme planners tend to fall into the frame of mind in which they are prepared to make any sacrifice, or more exactly, force any sacrifice on others in order to achieve the plan. So that a plan laid out for promoting the interests of the consumers often leads to the deliberate and implacable sacrifice of those interests. How does it come about that so many intelligent, sincere, and well-meaning people have been brought to accept for the attainment of their aims methods which are worse than useless for the purpose? How then have they been fooled or brought to fool themselves? As the Nobel Prize-winning economist Frederick Hayek aptly stated over 30 years ago, the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. The root of our troubles lies in the fallacy that the best way of ordering economic affairs is to place the responsibility of all crucial decisions in the hands of the state. This error, driven to its logical conclusion, as it is now being driven by those who have been put into power, can bring upon us untold miseries and humiliations of which the past 2 years have given us a foretaste. As Lenin said, quote, "We knew when we took power into our hands that there were no ready forms of concrete reorganization of the capitalist system into a socialist one." So they get the power, but they don't have the mechanism to make the transition. Today, the central planners have found, and apparently to some extent are succeeding, where Lenin failed, by identifying climate change as the mechanism to get the free economies of the West to sell their birthright for a pot of stew. William Blackstone defines the birthright of English-speaking people as life, liberty, and property. Black's Law Dictionary, in the preamble, states that the continued existence of a free and democratic society depends upon recognition of the concept that justice is based upon the rule of law. Stripped of all technicalities, this means that government is, in all its actions, is bound by rules fixed and announced beforehand, grounded in respect for the dignity of the individual and his capacity through reason for enlightened self-government. Law so grounded makes justice possible. For only through such law does the dignity of the individual attain respect and protection. Without it, individual rights become subject to unrestrained power, respect for law is destroyed, and rational self-government is impossible. Peter Drucker wrote a book years back in the 30s, I believe was when it was published, called The End of Economic Man. In that book, he said the planners are impoverishers. James Madison in the Federalist Papers said that it will be of little avail to the people that the laws are made by men of their own choice if the laws be so voluminous, ominous, that they cannot be read, or so incoherent that they cannot be understood. If they be replaced or revised before they are promulgated, or undergo such incessant changes that no man who knows what the law is today can guess what it will be tomorrow. This is happening under the Biden administration in extreme ways. We engaged under the Trump administration on many natural resource policy issues. The Bureau of Land Management, for example, has large planning regions that they go through full environmental impacts analyses and all sorts of documentation to develop a policy framework that governs the natural resources, the access and utilization of those resources through those regions. One of those RMPs that we worked on in Montana covers, I believe, 14 counties. And the issue is, as James Madison was said, if new administrations can just come in and flip-flop on regulations, it destabilizes the regulatory environment and makes it nearly impossible for our private enterprise to make capital investment in our natural resource industries. It causes tremendous economic confusion, which is the breeding ground of totalitarian ideas. There's sage-grouse plans for the sage-grouse that span 12 states. Same thing, resource management planning documents, big old thick policy documents that set the policy of how ranchers and miners and loggers and the people who are out there trying to access those resources to convert them to a product that's useful to you are dictated and prescribed on how, or even if, they can even touch those resources. It's a huge problem. And they're flip-flopping. These documents, these policy frameworks are supposed to be 20-year frameworks in policy, partly because we need stable regulatory frameworks for the market, for private investment, for capital investment in those resources. Who's going to spend millions of dollars for a modernized wood mill and all the things that go along with that if they don't know that the right and guarantee of access to those resources is going to be there to give a return on that investment? It's not going to happen. The oil and gas industry is under attack. So they've opened those sage-grouse plans. Those were a record of decision was finalized on those in 2015, and then later in 2017. Like I said, it's supposed to be 20-year planning documents. This administration has opened them all up, citing new science to justify it, without citing any references, no source documents, just climate change warrants us to open up these huge planning documents and to reanalyze how we're going to govern those lands, which destabilizes the marketplace and our ability to provide cheap, affordable energy and food and fiber for the American people and the rest of the world. So I'm going to read this quote, and then I'll tell you who said it, wrote it after. If an agency can enact a new rule of general applicability affecting huge swaths of the national economy one day and reverse itself the next, you might be forgiven for asking, where's the substantial guidance in that? And then if an agency can interpret the scope of its statutory jurisdiction one way one day and reverse itself the next, you might well wonder, where are the promised clearly delineated boundaries of agency authority? Add to this the fact that today many administrative agencies wield vast powers and are overseen by political appointees, and you have a pretty potent mix. Under any conception of our separation of powers, I would have thought powerful and centralized authorities like today's administrative agencies would have warranted less deference from other branches, not more. It's an arrangement, too, that seems pretty hard to square with the Constitution of the Founders' design. And as Justice Felix Frankfurter once observed, the assertion of dangerous power does not come in a day. It does come, however, slowly, from the generative force of unchecked disregard of the restrictions imposed by the Constitution. That's a quote from a book called The Republic If You Can Keep It, published in 2019 by sitting Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch. You know what he's saying? Give us a case. Give us something to work with. Where's all our attorneys? Thank God we do have some state attorney generals that are doing some things. Our attorney general, Knudsen. Schmidt out of Missouri. Last month, the 19th of October, 19 attorney generals opened up an investigation of 6 of the biggest banks in America for ceding their authority to the UN over the fiduciary duties for those states. We have litigation going up right now on the social cost of carbon under Executive Order 13990. And there's other litigation moving on those fronts. And the courts are asking for it. We happen to have 6 Supreme Court justices that are originalists, that hold, for the most part, it's not that I agree with all of them in all of their deliberations, but as I just read from Mr. Gorsuch, give us a case. We've allowed the administrative state and our bureaucracies to expand way beyond the limitations laid out in the federal Constitution. Antonin Scalia, the late Antonin Scalia, said the individual possesses, as the Declaration of Independence points out, a God-given freedom, which rightly counsels an attitude of suspicion, if not hostility, toward new impositions of governmental constraint. Black's Law Dictionary, and my time's running down, so I'll wrap it up, but the Black's Law Dictionary, 4th edition, defines sovereignty. Sovereignty is defined as the supreme, absolute, and uncontrollable power by which any independent state is governed. supreme political authority, paramount control of the Constitution and frame of government and its administration, the self-sufficient source of political power from which all specific political powers are derived, the international independence of a state, combined with the right and power of regulating its internal affairs without foreign dictation. Net zero by 2050, 30% reduction of greenhouse gas reductions by 2030. The Federal Land Policy Management Act says that all objectives and targets are to be established by law. None of those decarbonization objectives have been established through the Congress, through the Senate, and the bicameral process our Constitution demands. It is all being done by executive edict through the President's office and international powers, violating the sovereignty of our states. With that said, I'm just going to read one more quote. Supreme Court decision. The independent power of the states also serves as a check on the power of the federal government. By denying any one government complete jurisdiction over all the concerns of public life, federalism protects the liberty of the individual from arbitrary power. In the typical case, we look to the states to defend their prerogatives by adopting the simple expedient of not yielding to federal blandishments when they do not want to embrace the federal policies as their own. The states are separate and independent sovereigns. Sometimes they need to act like it.
Thank you very much. Nathan Descheemaeker, thank you so much, Nathan. Appreciate you.